excited to read some more submissions for the next Gritsch Fellow. So this is something that the Gritsch Fund does. We do numerous behind-the-scenes tours. We do the Luther Fest at Zion Lutheran. We do the symposium. And we try to extend the legacy of Eric Gritsch. Those of you who did not know him, do check out the website, ericwgritsch.org, all small letters. It'll tell you all about his experiences. So with that long introduction, we're going to get started with Paul, and thank you once again for coming.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, and that symposium will be here at the library, by the way, as it's known. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this brisk day. And I know parking can be a challenge around here. They just started the prep up again for young students this weekend. My name is Paul Espinosa. I'm the curator here at the George Peabody Library. And as Bonnie mentioned, I'm the president of the Eric W. Gritsch Memorial Fund. And so I love to be able to share what I do here at the library with groups, but especially with the Gritsch Fund. So this exhibit was the fruit of many hours of labor, as you can imagine. And I had a co-curator on this exhibit. His name is Jim Gillespie. He's the Geographic Information Systems librarian up at the main Johns Hopkins campus. We are part of Johns Hopkins University. And so his expertise is using old historic maps with modern technologies. And what's so great about a collection like this when it comes to a university is that we can empower some of these old maps, if you will, with the latest digital technologies. And so when we're in this corner over here, I'll plug in the laptop and show you a few slides of how Jim does that with students today. I was responsible for much of the historic context of the maps. And so I just want to show us a few slides to get us warmed up, get us thinking about this material, and then we'll visit each of the sections of the exhibit. And be sure to grab one of our little brochures over here. It shows how we divided the sections up. First we talked about Willard Hackerman, the collector, and then the early Chesapeake. These were his main collecting interests. Charting the early Chesapeake. Baltimore in maps and prints, the development of Baltimore, and then map making and modern technologies. So these were our four sections. Now, whenever I give a presentation for the Gritsch Fund, I'm always, my first thought, and I don't know if it should be or not, but my first thought is always, how do I relate this to the Reformation or to Protestants in some way? And so, fortuitously, this is our latest acquisition. I bought this last week. It hasn't even arrived yet. But this is a wonderful, what they call choreographic rendering of a map of Europe. Okay? And the only reason I knew about this is because a professor at Hopkins came down looking for this image in a book, which we own, by a gentleman named Heinrich Blumenthal, who was a Protestant theologian. And this dates from the 1580s. Okay? He was looking for this image for the cover of his current book, which is all about the Habsburg Empire. We found it in our book, in the collection, but it's in black and white. It wasn't hand-colored like this one is. And he wanted to put this on the cover of his book, and he said, oh, he's been looking for a colored copy. Is it in copyright? I mean, how would he get the copy? And so we went online, and we actually found a single sheet that is hand-colored. And so we bought it for the library, and now when it arrives, we'll scan it, and he can put it on his book cover. But it's just such an amazing image, I couldn't resist it. And I think what that shows is putting together this map exhibit gave me the map collecting bug myself. And this is known as Europa Raveena, so Europe as queen, if you will. And the little reading I've done about it, Bunting is trying to emphasize the fact that the Habsburg Empire really is crowned here in Spain, right? Here's the lower part of Spain, the upper part of Africa. And that Sicily is part of that empire as well, so there's the orb and the cross. And Rome, and here's Bohemia highlighted as well, and the German lands here. And Rome gets short shrift. So in other words, he's showing that it's an imperial empire, the empire of Philip II, as opposed to the Pontiff's empire, if you will. This is one reading of this map. But it's just such a wonderful rendering. And one thing we often do is we take for granted what we consider the naivete, perhaps, of some of these older maps. But it's quite remarkable just how close and accurate they were able to attain with these maps. Now, this is not meant to be scientific by any means. This is allegorical, emblematic. But when you superimpose, right, this is the famous Waldseemüller map of 1507. Look at that outline. There's the Europa Raveena. Isn't that pretty remarkable if you think about it? Right? He's able to take this image and transform it into this. And it's not all that inaccurate, really. So that is our latest acquisition. And come by when it arrives, probably next week sometime. Take a closer look.
I have a question.
Sure.
The body of water on the far right of that map, what is that? The Caspian Sea or?
Where? Here?
Very far right. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
So this is bad resolution, but so yeah, you've got Constantinople here.
Right.
So I guess so.
Or Black Sea.
The Black Sea, probably. Yeah. Here's Asia. This is Greece. Here's Sicily. So yeah, the Black Sea. Okay. Good. We have a map. Enthusiast. This is not a very good resolution, I know, but this is the famous John Smith map of 1612, and we've got it on the wall over there, and so you get a better look at it. But what a group of students did was they overlaid it with the current, it's kind of hard to see, but the red there is the modern scientific map of it, and it's amazing just how accurate somebody like Smith, in 3 months of sailing up and down the coastline in the Chesapeake, was able to achieve this. And then when you think about the fact that a lot of this has suffered erosion and degradation over the 400 years, it's quite, again, remarkable. Now, people often wonder, why collect these old maps, right? There are certain different levels of enthusiasm, right? There are bibliophiles that will collect books just for the bindings, or association copies. And then there are map collectors who are crazy about maps, and they'll just buy up as many maps as they can. Well, it turns out collecting goes way back, all the way to the Renaissance. And this was the cartographer, the alchemist, the advisor to Queen Elizabeth in England, John Dee. And he translated in 1570 Euclid's Elements of Geometry. This is a book all about mathematics and geography and you name it, all the applications of mathematics. It's here in the case here. And what I love is this wonderful quote here. Now, I didn't black this out on the original, but just listen to his language here. He says, geography, I'm going to skip all this, of this art, how great pleasure and how manifold commodities do come unto us, daily and hourly, of most men is perceived, while some, to beautify their halls, parlors, chambers, galleries, studies, or libraries, with other some for things past, right? Some either for their own journeys, directing into fair or far lands, or to understand of other men's travails, right? Other men's travels or other hardships, to conclude, some for one purpose and some for another, liketh, loveth, getteth, and useth maps, charts, and geographical globes. So he's saying here, right? Some people use them for practical means, but a lot of people just buy them to beautify their halls, chambers, galleries, and libraries. Okay? So this idea of collecting maps just for their artistic beauty and scientific interest goes way back. Okay? This is a wonderful title page. This didn't make it into the exhibit. I wanted it to, but it didn't quite make it. But this is a French atlas, 1730. And if you focus in on this little printer's device here, you can see this is a map dealer's office here. And so you've got gentlemen here pulling maps and for purchase, just maps alone, not in books, right? We often have this perception that, oh, did somebody rip these out of books and sell them? Sometimes they were, but often they were just sold separately. The printer knew the map would be a commodity and would print them up separately as well. But what I love is, I don't know if you can see that in this detail. So these people are picking out maps and paying for the maps here. And here you have Atlas, right? The Greek mythological god, holding up the world, holding up the globe. And you have this little boy here in that same posture, pulling a map off the shelf. Right? And so it's really a nice conjunction there. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Hackerman, the collector of this exhibit, of this material. He was actually a Hopkins alumnus who graduated in 1938. And then he became the CEO of the Whiting Turner Contracting Company. I imagine some of you have heard of Whiting Turner, quite an important contractors here in Baltimore. This was his favorite portrait. We have it on the wall over there because it shows Mr. Whiting, his mentor, in the background here. 1938, he graduates from Hopkins. He's all of 19 years old, I believe. He then applies for, 19 or 20 years old, he applies to work at the small Whiting Turner company, which is all of about 4 folks at the time. He doesn't get the job. Another Hopkins alumnus gets the job. That guy's math skills are sad. So they call up their second choice, Willard. And he steps in and he works for the company from about 1940 until his death in 2014. And this was his philosophy: if you give $1 to help others, the Lord will give you 10 back. He was quite generous in his philanthropy. He was responsible for the naming of the School of Engineering at Hopkins, the Whiting School of Engineering. Gave lots of money to the Wilmer Eye Institute and the medical institutions at Hopkins as well. You could read more about him on the placard there. But he had this wonderful map gallery, okay, just like John D. suggested, down on East Pratt Street, down in the Inner Harbor. And this is what the gallery looked like. And so he would take guests and clients through there, whether they wanted to go or not. They wanted business with Whiting Turner. They happily obliged Mr. Hackerman and took a tour of his gallery. And so you can see, we actually got on the wall about 40 maps. It's only about 1/3 of what was in his collection, believe it or not. And so, but all the maps and all the prints did come to Hopkins. Okay. And just to give you a sense of all their work, right? This is the Inner Harbor, as you can see. All the orange buildings are all Whiting Turner buildings. Wow. Believe it or not. So, here's another view. Even the Raven Stadium was done by Whiting Turner. So, you do all this, you can afford these sorts of maps, right? Okay. So with that, let's get up. We're going to stretch our legs, and we're just going to walk right over here. And I'm going to show you a few objects, and then we'll pop around the exhibit. Okay? So just watch your step. We'll give you a chance at the end, if you're not too tired, to walk around and look at things in a little more detail. I'm not going to be able to hit every high point. But what I do like is this map over here in the corner. This is actually a German map or produced by a German publisher. It was originally an English map, but it's marketed to German immigrants. This is from 1740, coming to the New World, coming to the Chesapeake. And so there's high points of German living and trade that are highlighted in that map. It's up here as well. And I love the cartouche there, right? You can see what would have been an English merchant up here, right? And his coat of arms, Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. And you can see all these native peoples, right? Showing the abundance and the bounty of the New World. But look what you have back here. What's this? Does anybody know?
Tobacco barn.
It's a tobacco barn, a drying house for tobacco, right? And so already in 1740, right, they're signaling this is the main cash crop here in Baltimore, right? So that's interesting to see there. As I mentioned, this map is not quite accurate. It's more for political or immigration purposes. There's the Germantown I was mentioning, right? But look, here's Virginia, the Carolinas. This is the panhandle of Florida. They got it way up here. It's supposed to be out here, right? But scholars believe that this is meant to identify different areas of trade and socioeconomic commerce, if you will. And so it's not meant to be quite accurate. But this map was important to Willard because this was given to him by his sister-in-law the year before she dies. And in this, you know, when we received the map, we kept it in its original frame. We reframed a lot of the other maps. We kept it in its original frame because on the back of there was this birthday card here. And it's from Doris, his sister-in-law, and she teases him and she says, "For our birthday boy." It was for his 80th birthday. And she basically says in that card, "I hope this map measures up for the collection." And of course it did. Okay, so I mentioned he went to Hopkins. Come closer, will you come closer? Don't be shy. So this was a real surprise and a real treat. We received the maps finally from his daughter, Willard Hackerman's daughter, Nancy. And when I learned that he was a Hopkins alumnus, I asked our archivist up at the main campus, I said, "Is there a student file on Willard?" And then a couple days later, he showed up with a folder, and he says, "This is it." And in that folder was Willard's original application, there in the green. It's dated June 30th, 1935, okay? And then July 9th, okay, 10 days later, he's nervous, and he writes to the registrar, and he says, "Did you receive my application?" Okay, July 9th. On July 16th, they write back to him, and they say, "Dear Mr. Hackerman, this is to inform you that your application for admission to the School of Engineering has been accepted. You'll receive more information." But look, it's just on a piece of tissue paper. There's not even a Hopkins letterhead or anything like that. And then also in that file was his first day's list of classes: physics, applied mechanics, surveying, engineering, and military science. This is 1935, remember. Okay? And then even this set of what they call mugshots from his first year at Hopkins. And these would have been cut up normally and put into the different student files as they advance throughout the years. So what's fun to think about, right? An undergraduate today does everything electronically. And these sorts of materials don't often survive. We call this ephemera. But Hopkins does a good job of keeping all these student files. And so when we put this in the exhibit, Nancy, his daughter, had never seen these, and I think she was real tickled. She was quite touched to see these. Because even it's signed, his application is signed at the bottom, Nathan Hackerman, which was his father, and that was Nancy's grandfather. And that's just to guarantee that he'll pay if Willard gets in. Some things never change. What's fun to think about, he took surveying, right? And he would eventually apply those skills in his job at Whiting-Turner. And Jim and I had a chance to go out to the Whiting-Turner headquarters in Towson and meet with the current president, a gentleman named Tim Regan. And Tim told us all all his memories of Willard, and then handed us this little portable surveyor's level that's kept in a little leather case and still has Willard's name on it. This was an early surveyor's level that Willard would have used in his early days at Whiting-Turner to make sure a trench was dug straight or the foundation was laid level. And it's just fun to think about the fact that that's a primitive instrument compared to some of the surveying instruments that were eventually used to create these maps. And little did he know when he's in his 20s using that instrument that he would be collecting these wonderful maps. He was something of a Renaissance man. He spent most of his time working, but when he wasn't, he actually liked to sculpt as well. And so there's a small bust in here of a woman after Modigliani, the famous Italian painter. And Willard sculpted that in clay and then had it cast in bronze. And that sat in his gallery as well. Okay, let's move down here. I want to show you an interesting conjunction or coincidence. So what we tried to do with the collection is not just put it on the walls, but we wanted to evoke some of the historical context, okay, of these materials with books and ephemera and that sort of thing. Here's the D, as I mentioned. But we also found, attached to the back of this map, a dealer description from a New York dealer named Martanya Land, who's in New York. And they sent this. It's not dated, so we don't know exactly when they sent this. They sent this description to Willard, describing this map. And he bit, right? He couldn't resist. Lots of reasons why I think he couldn't resist. This is a map of the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays. It was originally published in 1832, okay? But this one is, it says corrected 1862. This is an extremely rare map. That 1832 map circulated widely. But the dealer believes that it was corrected in 1862 just for the Civil War, okay? It shows the railroad line between D.C. and Baltimore, but it also has all these intricate shoal depths, right, for ships that were maneuvering, bringing supplies during the Civil War, and even little vignettes of the approaches so that you could see the lighthouses and that sort of thing, okay? And people often wonder, well, it's so discolored, right? What happened to that map? This was done on purpose. This is what happened to a lot of maps. This was put on linen, it was pasted on linen, and then shellacked, right, to try to make it a little waterproof, and then it would have been rolled up, right? So again, for its practical use, okay? This one was meant to be used during the Civil War. What's remarkable as well, and the dealer calls attention to this, it has its original salesman's ticket pasted to it. Hager and Brothers, Nautical and Mathematical Instruments, number 28 Thames Street, which is down by the Inner Harbor, okay? Thames or Thames Street, right? Baltimore, Maryland. This is where this map was purchased. These things often flake off, right? This is where it was purchased. It's a neat story if you think about it, right? The map was printed here in Baltimore, sold here in Baltimore, ended up with a New York dealer, made its way back to Baltimore because of the good offices of Mr. Hackerman, and now resides here in Baltimore forever. So that's a neat story. When I started researching this address, lo and behold, does anybody know who the proprietor was at number 28 Thames Street? I'll be impressed if you do. It was a Mr. Knight, okay? And Mr. Knight owned a bookstore there where this map was sold. And it was the same bookstore where an important American bought his first book. And I'm going to ask my friend Ray to read out loud for us this quote, and I want you to guess who this is from.
When I was about 13 years old and had succeeded in learning to read, every increase in knowledge, especially anything respecting the free states, was an additional weight to the almost intolerable burden of my thought. I am a slave for life. Fortunately, I had earned a little money in blacking boots for some gentleman, with which I purchased of Mr. Knight on Thames Street what was then a very popular school book, the Columbian Orator, for which I paid 50 cents. I was led to buy this book by hearing some little boys say they were going to learn some pieces out of it for recitation.
Who's that? Good, Frederick Douglass. So he says, I bought of Mr. Knight at Thames Street, the Columbian Orator. This is the same bookseller that sold Frederick Douglass his book. That will come up again in the Baltimore section, so just keep that in mind.
So what's there now?
Office buildings, or maybe a restaurant, who knows.
The horse you came in on.
Yeah, that's a good question. Anyway, wonderful correspondences, right? Historic, reaching into the historic past, if you will. So that's what makes this material come alive, and we can use it in teaching, right? So every time we put this map in front of a student class, we're going to read that quote, right? Just like this group of undergraduates, right? Okay, let's head over to the Chesapeake section. We actually have two copies of this book, believe it or not. We had a copy here at the Peabody, and then a copy at the Garrett Library, which is part of the Evergreen Museum as well. This was a book published in 1590 describing Thomas Harriot's voyages, or sorry, Walter Raleigh's voyages to the New World, right? The failed colony at Roanoke, right? And on that journey, or on that adventure, was a gentleman named John White, who painted, this is a facsimile, but painted these little miniatures of the Algonquin Indians there in Virginia, okay? And then when he made it back to London, these paintings were eventually created into copper plates. And then these copper plates became so popular and important that actually a German publisher published these books. This one is in English for an English audience. This one is in Latin for a more cosmopolitan audience. There were also German editions and French editions. What you can see is this mother and her daughter ended up in that engraving almost verbatim, okay? Somebody come up here close. What is that little girl holding? Can you tell? Come on up. What is the little girl holding? She's holding a rattle in one hand, and what's she holding in the other hand? A doll. But how is that doll dressed? Dressed as a European noblewoman, right? So already you're seeing a bit of acculturation, right? Colonization, if you will. Now, what's interesting is that that same little vignette will actually end up on the first map of the Chesapeake, okay? So let's come over here. And if you don't get a good view of this right away, come back after we're done. But this is the first map, 1590, okay, to actually name the Chesapeake. Here it's named here. And they only get the opening, the mouth of it, okay? One thing I want to point out as well is, you see this big compass rose here, right? Well, we tried to reproduce it here on the wall. And when you look at these maps, it's strange because the north is oriented over here, right? I mean, it's correct if we were to flip this up, right? The north would be going up that way. But the reason they oriented the compass rose this way is for the sailors making landfall. They would see where to go into port. Right? That was more important than understanding the full geography of the whole coastline. And so this orientation will get repeated on all these maps throughout the Chesapeake, throughout the 17th and 18th century. Here, it's hard to see, but here is that matron and her daughter shown right here. Okay. This is all a copper plate engraving, by the way. as are all these maps along this wall. This was, you know, copper plates are more expensive to produce and take much more time, but they want that for very intricate work, like a map with all these wonderful details. That big banner over there, this was a nice discovery in our collection, comes from a book in the case below it. This is the first book, this is 1598, to ever depict a map maker at work. And that's actually a wood block, believe it or not. What's neat is that the map he's actually working on there is this same map that sits next to him here. You can see the same terrain, right?
Oh, wow.
It's pretty neat. My favorite detail in this is not the historical accuracy of the burr-in and the ink. It's his little foot poking out. Isn't that great? This one is full of charming woodcuts. But you can see a woodcut can produce a pretty good map, right, in general. But a copper plate can do much, much more.
Are there any copper plates still surviving?
Sure, we actually have one in the case over there. So
oh, okay.
Take a peek over there. Okay, come on down. This, as I mentioned, is the John Smith map, 1612. Okay. John Smith, of course, is really the second voyage of the English to Jamestown. And he sails up and down the coast here for about 3 months, and it produces this amazingly accurate and beautiful map, really, if you think about it. Look at that bandolier there of Virginia. Why is it named Virginia?
For the Virgin
After the Virgin Queen, right? Queen Elizabeth. And here you have the Susquehanna native, okay? What's important about this is that Smith names all these different Indian territories. And the biggest is this one here, Powhatan, right? And there's Powhatan there. And this is the whole narrative, right, of where Smith is taken captive, brought before the emperor, the Indian emperor, and then what happens? Pocahontas, right, frees him. And the rest is history, as they say. The earliest depictions of the Susquehanna Indians had them with the bow and the club, but actually carrying a quiver of arrows. Right? So they looked a little more warlike, a little more military. But when Smith puts it in, he puts in a boar or a pig, right, to disarm them a little bit. Right? This is what scholars think is happening. To disarm them a little bit and show again the abundance of the land. So come to Virginia, come to Maryland, there is abundance there. Now, the Smith map is so important that it will influence all subsequent maps. So here you have a German version, here you have a Dutch version. This is hand colored. So somebody, after this was made, sat there with a little blue watercolor and filled that in. Now, this is all really focused on Virginia. This is what we call the Lord Baltimore map, right? This one is a 1671 version. It was first published in book form in 1635, okay? And this was in this small pamphlet called A Relation of Maryland, okay? Together with a map of the country, London, 1635. This was meant to promote the new colony, okay? By Cecil Calvert had this printed up to bring colonists to the new world. Now, that map there we reproduced up here, okay? And I want you to notice a few things here. Here they're calling it the new map of Maryland. Right? And for the first time, you're seeing the boundaries. Okay, so this is all Virginia. Here's the southern boundary, and then here's the northern boundary with Pennsylvania. Okay, so look how close it is to the river here, or to the bay. Okay, just notice that. The other thing to notice is who do we have here, right? Here's Lord Baltimore's arms. Okay, here's the King's arms, King James I, right? So this is still highly an English colony, right? With the Lord Proprietor beneath the king. Well, by 1671, in this colored version, look what's happening. Now you have Lord Baltimore's coat of arms. The King's arms have disappeared. He's really staking his claim for this territory. And he subtly moves, or has his cartographer, it's hard to tell, but this is pretty close. He moves the border north a little bit. Into William Penn's territory. Of course, there is a big dispute with the Penns until they finally hash it out. But just on this map, he's already doing that subtly. This is all painted. When you see these hand-painted versions, these were often meant for the aristocratic audience or somebody well-to-do. Not all maps got painted as a matter of course. Okay?
What's the market value of, I mean, if you wanted to buy one of these maps, how much would you expect to pay, assuming they're available?
That's a good question. I mean, something like the Smith map is so important and so iconic that you won't even find one for sale.
Really?
Yeah. Again, if you can't see, come back. We mentioned Frederick Douglass, okay? We actually have a first edition of his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, 1845, okay? Of course, Frederick Douglass works as a ship caulker down at the Inner Harbor, okay? He actually makes his way to freedom by impersonating, with paperwork, a free African American. He makes his way to Delaware, and he makes his way north. Finally ends up in Boston and publishes his narrative of his life, in which he describes the moment of learning to read and that sort of thing. Now, he becomes the most prominent abolitionist in the States, and in 1864, he's earned his freedom. Legally, he's free. So he makes his way back to Baltimore at the invitation of the Bethel Church. Okay? And he delivers a lecture. This is 1864, the Civil War, right? It's looking like the North is going to win. And he says, in this lecture, right, it's about 6 pages long there, he says, now that we are earning our freedom, the next step is to give the African American the right to vote, to enfranchise former enslaved people. That's 1864. It's not till 1870 that the 15th Amendment does pass, giving people the right to vote regardless of their former condition. And so this beautiful lithograph was produced on May 19th, 1870 here in Baltimore. They held this parade here in Baltimore celebrating the passage of the 15th Amendment. You've got Lincoln and Grant, Frederick Douglass, Benjamin Banneker, other abolitionists, right? John Brown, yeah. And here, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state, okay? And then you have a ballot box here, pillars, right? And they're built on science and education. Okay? So this is also part of the improvement movements in the African American community. And then I love this vignette. Here is a African American teacher giving a geography lesson, right, to 2 young students, right? So, of course, we still have a long way to go on this front, right? But you're seeing, right, these ideas take shape in these lithographs. These are extremely rare, as you can imagine, right? This only would have been kept for the occasion, would have been produced for the occasion, and a lot of these ended up thrown away.
Who was the lithographer?
Schneider and Fuchs, Utah Street, that's where they were located. Okay, let's come over here. What's known as the Poppleton map of Baltimore. This one is 1852. It was first published in 1830 or 1822. This is a revision for 1852. What makes it so important is you're not seeing a lot of UTVLs. You can see a lot of those districts, right, from the Inner Harbor. This would have been together, right? It's broken apart at this point. But what it expresses is all the civic pride in Baltimore, because all these vignettes around the border
are highlighting important institutions and places. Is design on here?
That's what I was just looking for. And usually
Here's City Hall. Here's City Hall. Here's.
there it is.
I bet that's it.
Yeah.
German Lutheran Church. Okay. So here's Zion. For those that you don't know, a lot of this group is from Zion Church, where Dr. Gritsch was a pastor and participated quite a bit. So there's Zion. And what I love, here's the Battle Monument, of course. Here is the Washington Monument, which is right outside of our doors. Okay. And then, if you look, what's so interesting is that why sometimes these things don't survive. In this little book, what somebody did is they cut all these little vignettes out, and then they just pasted them into the book. This is from the 1822 version. When this superseded this version, they thought, we don't need the old one. They cut it up and they put it in the book, just as a sort of souvenir, right? Another fun one is the Sun Iron Building. Have you heard of this one before? Here it is here. It was all cast iron facade. It was so important they even wrote a song about it. What were you going to say?
I think that the Meade Monumental Foundry produced the facade for the Sun building.
It was destroyed during the fire, I think.
I believe, yeah. And somebody even found another set and hand-colored those vignettes. So just these little vignettes themselves were collector's items. Okay. I want to point out another interesting, since we're here, this is a lithograph of the Washington Monument. Okay. Why is this monument so important? First one to Washington, right? And what you can see here is you can see the first phase of the Peabody Institute. It's all there in white, sort of city on the hill there, around all these brick buildings. You can see that you could climb to the top of the monument and see all the way down to the Inner Harbor, right? In this lithograph. And what's so interesting is that this monument was so important, right, that a famous author who never visited Baltimore, as far as we know, would have seen prints like this, even in New York. And why do I say that? Because listen to this line. He says, "Great Washington, too, stands high aloft on his towering mainmast in Baltimore. And like one of Hercules' pillars, his column marks that point of human grandeur, beyond which few mortals will go." Okay. This is from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This is the first edition, 1851. That monument is so important, he's comparing it to the mainmast of a ship. Ishmael's up there looking out for whales, and he's having these reveries, and he remembers this image of Washington on his mainmast. Okay, let's make our way over here. I'm almost done, I promise. If you can stand in front of the screen for me for a second. Are there any questions about anything so far?
I often wonder with those lithographic aerial views of the city like that George Washington one, artists sort of know where the buildings, you know, it's all these background buildings. They didn't, were they working off of photographs? How is there any idea how they did that?
These are often called bird's eye views,
Yeah.
and they were often produced by going up in a balloon and actually drawing and sketching it, and then going on the ground and walking that sketch on the ground and making adjustments.
Isn't that something?
It's quite remarkable.
Yes.
Sections.
Huh. To go up in
Is there a single book that contains images from these maps of Baltimore?
There was, so these maps, some of these maps, I mentioned this is only about a third of Mr. Hackerman's collection. Some of these have been put on display at the Maryland Historical Society way back in the 80s. And so I do have a small book that shows a lot of these, if you're interested. Just see me afterwards. But our plans are to digitize all these maps, put them online for anybody to access and to zoom in on and use this technology with those maps. And one of my goals is to write up the prints that you see and put those in some historic context as well. Okay, so how do professors at Hopkins use this? A professor at Hopkins named Mary Ryan is producing a book called Taking the Land to Build a City. It's coming out this year, and she examines San Francisco and Baltimore and compares and contrasts. And on the cover of that image was that plate that print we saw of the Baltimore Museum. So this is all student work that Jim has done with professors and students at Hopkins. So they did a project on Billie Holiday in Baltimore and Frederick Bailey, who is Frederick Douglass, here in Baltimore. So Lawrence Jackson at Hopkins has worked with graduate students on this project. I'll just let this play here. So what they did was they were able to plot where she was living at different times in the city, and then they can stop and they can compare this stuff. You know, oh well, there was a brothel here, or there was her school was over here. There was lots of crime here. This informed her blues and this sort of thing. They're using the famous Sanborn maps. So this was her elementary school, okay. The Royal Theater, where she performed in 1940, came back and performed in 1945. These are the famous Sanborn insurance maps. I don't know if you've ever seen these. These are amazingly detailed. And they tell you, because they're for insurance purposes, if you zoom in and you look at them, they'll say, they have so many buckets of water on the premises in case there's a fire. And this sort of thing.
They also, I think they also list the type of heating system.
Yeah. My favorite is project that came out of this was the Frederick Douglass project. So I mentioned...
So this is another one of those aerial view things, right? They probably made that by going up in a balloon.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is a bird's eye view. And this is down at the Inner Harbor. Here is Thames Street.
Yeah.
Where he bought his first book. His master, Mr. Auld, and his wife lived on Philpont Street. If you read his biography, I encourage you to go read his biography. There's a new biography about Frederick Douglass. It was recent, it just came out. But his autobiography details how Mr. Auld's wife, his master's wife, taught him the alphabet. And when Mr. Auld hears about this, he's, goes berserk. And Douglass describes that as the first anti-slavery speech he ever heard when he hears the master upset about him learning to read. So this is 1869 Saxon. Yeah. So this is how it might have looked during Douglass's time as a ship culker. You can see all the lumber here by the ships. And then what they did was they plotted based on surveys, but also census records where African Americans were living at the time. These are the spots where Douglass was living and working. These were alleys of free blacks. So Dr. Jackson thinks, right, or he's trying to draw the conclusion between Douglass, interacting with these folks. I mentioned he gets his forged papers to freedom from other free African Americans. But this doesn't show up on the map, right? These African American communities are often not documented. It's only by superimposing census records and that sort of thing onto the map that you can see where they lived. You can even do this for more current situations. So what you're seeing here, this is 1937 residential security maps, redlining maps. Okay, and you can see they're dividing it into first grade areas to live, right? Fourth grade. Right? This is all down at the Inner Harbor. This is 1937. Okay.
Wow.
Neighborhoods were graded, right, based on for commercial loans and based on their racial makeup. Okay.
Not a lot of green.
Not a lot of green. These, another history professor at Hopkins, mapping inequality. He's taken what are called these green zones. This was all during the New Deal, or sorry, brownfields they're called. Sites complicated by the presence of hazardous substances, today known as brownfields, lowest graded areas on the 1937 map, right? So these were where, you know, gas stations and where the land has become toxic through dumping, through
today's environmental justice argument, right? That in depressed neighborhoods is where all the nasty stuff goes.
Exactly.
That's exactly the data that they used to make those cases.
Exactly. And so he's doing this during the New Deal in the 30s. And so
there's Wagner's Point and Fairfield all down there. Yeah.
Yeah, down around the Chesapeake School.
Yeah.
That was the Masonville Cove, was all reclaimed from brownfield.
Yeah. So it's easy for us to get on our soapbox, right, about these different issues. But when you see a map like this, doesn't it bring it home? I mean, doesn't it? You can't argue with this, right? With this geography.